Welcome, participants and panelists. Good evening, everyone. I'm Thomas Red, Patron Experience Supervisor of Sumner Library, and I would like to thank everyone for joining the Mary Ann Keyes Book Club panel event this evening. I'm thrilled to see the number of folks here today willing to engage in a virtual discussion for the book Caste, Origins of Our Discontents. In her book, Isabel Wilkerson draws commonalities within the brand of systemic racism that the United States has manufactured and contextualizes a reality of caste in the United States. Wilkerson juxtaposes the caste system of India, the Third Reich of Nazi Germany, and the various human experiences developed through these value systems as explored by Wilkerson's text. Personally, I gained a wealth of knowledge while reading this title. It was one of the most in-depth studies of systemic racism that I've read thus far. This book offered a global lens for caste while centering the experience of Black Americans, descendants of American slavery within an evolving definition of race in the United States. On behalf of Hennepin County Library, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists and welcome everyone to this community discussion. For the land acknowledgement, as part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacy of dispossession and what noted scholars today call settler colonialism, Hennepin County Library, with the guidance of Minnesota, our Native Advisory Council, acknowledges that the magnificent land and vibrant waterways upon which county institutions are situated is the cultural, spiritual, and indigenous homeland of the Dakota Nation. A prominent term of endearment that describes the Dakota gratitude for their homeland and innumerable lakes and rivers in Minnesota, Macalester, and the land of misty waters. This land acknowledgement calls attention to the Dakota people's ongoing connection to this spiritual place and how institutions today continue to benefit from settler colonialism. It also calls attention to the importance of confronting Minnesota and the United States' violent and genocidal history that forced the Dakota from their land through treaties and military campaigns, such as 1863 Dakota Removal Act. Therefore, we recognize how the library can work with tribal communities whose land they are now situated on to explain this difficult history to the public while supporting scholarship and programming that amplify contemporary Native American voices. The Mary Ann Key Book Club is a collaboration between Hennepin County Library, Columnist, Mr. Myron Medcalf, and the Star Tribune, and sponsored by the Friends of Hennepin County Library. For the structure today, today's program is presented as a webinar. If you have questions for our panelists, please type them in the Q&A chat box found towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be read aloud to our panelists during the Q&A break. Around 7:30 p.m., you can also turn on the closed captions by clicking on the CC and selecting Show Subtitle. For the set agreements for the audience and the panelist participants. 1, acknowledge our identities, create differing life experiences that inform our perspectives. 2, be willing to explore different views rather than dismiss or deny them. 3, take space, make space, give grace. 4, expect and accept non-closure. Racism is deeply embedded and has existed for centuries. We won't gain closure to these issues today. 5, use I statements. No one speaks for another or an entire group of people. 6, focus on your own experiences. 7, listen with curiosity and the willingness to learn and change. 8, resist the desire to interrupt. 9, Be brief and share the time equitably. 10, expect to experience discomfort. 11, take care of yourselves emotionally and physically too. Take breaks when needed. 12, leadership challenge. Share the lessons you learned from this book and today's discussion, and inspire your friends and family to make a difference. And now, I would like to introduce this evening's facilitator, Mr. Myron Medcalf. Myron is currently a senior college basketball report and nationally syndicated radio host with ESPN. He also writes a semi-monthly column for the Star Tribune. Hennepin County is pleased to be collaborating with Mr. Medcalf on the Mary Ann Keyes Book Club, a book club inspired by Myron and also named after the matriarch of his family. Myron has also been a contributor to the Mary Ann Keyes Book Club newsletter. Thank you, Mr. Medcalf, for joining us this evening to discuss the book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents.
Thank you, Thomas. That was an incredible introduction. Thank you for your work to this effort. Thank you to everybody, really, who has contributed. There are some people who won't speak tonight: Kia Vang, Christy Mulligan, Ayana Muada, who behind the scenes with Hennepin County Library have been incredible. Just the support we have received from friends of the Hennepin County Library, from the Star Tribune, and then just the buy-in from the people. The feedback has been incredible. And as you'll see soon, our panel, it's the best of the best. And I'm incredibly excited to just launch this first event. And I really hope that it's the first of many events. That's the goal. I'd like to start, before I introduce our panelists, by saying a little bit about Mary Ann Key. She was a slave in the 1840s and 50s. She was purchased as a teenager. And she was someone that in my family we've known about, because we have an incredible history. We've tracked our history. I know a lot of families have not. But the key person in that is a woman named Sarah B. Harrigan. She's the family historian. She was the one that always tied all the dots, tied all the steps together, and introduced us all to Mary Ann Key. She was the first person that I ever knew who had a Black History Museum in her home. You would go down to her basement and you would see books and artifacts and just things that told the story of Black history. And she was the one that put the documents together about Mary Ann Key and kind of took the past into the present. We would not be here if it wasn't for my aunt, Sarah B. Harrigan. On Saturday, I was one of the pallbearers for my Aunt Sarah's funeral, which was a difficult thing. But 3 days later, here we are, meeting in the name of Mary Ann Key. And I just wanted to say that because it wouldn't be possible without my Aunt Sarah. This idea, this vision, people are calling it my book club, and it's not. It's our book club. And I hope everyone takes ownership of that. When you talk about it, if you're a part of this book club, say it's your book club. It's not mine, because I think it's important for us to feel attached to this effort in this incredible moment. And I just think there are so many people who have expressed a desire to learn, to grow, to move forward. And I'm excited. And I'm also just inspired by what this effort has become. I'll be honest with you all. My original idea was to start a Google Doc and just to sign people up. Then a couple of people who are much smarter than I am said, that's not a good idea. So I'm really grateful to the Hennepin County Library and just everything that they have done to make this a reality. Friends of the Hennepin County Library, Star Tribune, so many community partners who have made this real. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panel. And let me say a quick word about the whole panel. A lot of times events like this, people will go outside. They'll go to LA or New York or Texas and try to find an expert. And I think it's important for people to understand that your experts live right here in Minnesota. And they are incredible individuals who have a lot to say about this great book that we all read together, and I'll introduce them one by one. Elder Mahmoud El-Kati is a lecturer, author, and commentator on the African-American experience. El-Kati is Professor Emeritus of History at Macalester College in St. Paul. I was 18 years old when I sat at the elder's feet at the Pan-African Conference in Minnesota State, Mankato, and I just learned so much from him. And I'm so grateful that Elder would participate in this panel. Shannon Gibney is a writer, educator, activist, and the author of See No Color, Dream Country. See No Color and Dream Country, young adult novels that won Minnesota Book Awards in 2016 and 2019, respectively. Gibney is faculty in English at Minneapolis College, where she teaches writing. So excited for you to be here, Shannon. We had an awesome conversation. Looking forward to your contributions. Lissa Jones-Lofgren is the radio host of Urban Agenda on KMOJ-FM and podcast host of Black Market Reads. I've only known Lissa for, I think, about 6 or 7 months, and I've already learned so much from her. Every time we have a conversation, it just adds so much to my life. Thank you, Lissa, for being here. Terri Thao is a program director of Nexus Community Partners and is responsible for the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, which trains and places participants on publicly appointed boards or commissions with the goal to advance equity in the Twin Cities region. Terri, thank you so much for being here. I loved our conversation a couple of months ago, just talking about solidarity and the ways that the Black community and the AAPI community can come together in moments like this. I'm honored that you would join us as well. Looking forward to your contribution. And last but not least, Dr. Artika Tyner is an educator, lawyer, author, speaker, and advocate for justice. She is committed to training students to serve as social justice engineers who create new inroads to justice and freedom. And I said last, but I meant second to last, because we are also joined by the great Ramona Kitto Stately. She is an enrolled member of the Santee Sioux Dakota Nation. After 15 years teaching Indian education in Minnesota, she is now project director for We Are Still Here Minnesota, creating action for narrative change. In the build up to this event, we had a great conversation about what we wanted this panel to be. And I'm still struck by something that Ramona said in our conversation. She said for her people, it has been 12,000 years. And I think that's something we've all thought about in sort of time and how long we've had to address these issues. Thank you, Ramona, for joining us. So right now we're going to get to the questions. We've talked about some of these questions. I hope you all will gain a lot of insight. And we're going to start with Dr. Tyner, Elder Mahmoud. The first question, we'll start with you, Elder Mahmoud. What is the most critical and urgent message in Caste?
Well, get ready for one of the maybe greatest chapter in American history. And that is the least that you can expect. And this struggle against the doctrine of white supremacy, which functions as a secular religion, just as communism does. It's a secular religion. That means this: the religion, or universal definition of religion, is that it is a thing to which people owe their highest loyalty. You can call it God, you can call it Yahweh, you can call him Elihum, and so forth. The white supremacy doctrine has corrupted nearly everything institution with this new idea in the world, and it's been around for only 400 or 500 years, that white people are inherently, naturally, by nature, by God, by any way you want to measure, superior to other human beings. That is what the fight is all about. And everything you can name that human beings do. And America has been a part of the great success of the West, being the most powerful nations, built on this doctrine, on this caste, which is emerging in the vocabulary of people. Everybody should know what caste is. America didn't invent caste. Caste is old when the world was young. but no caste system like this. You can't compare it to the ancient caste system to India or anywhere else. And caste systems have been based on skills and crafts, and there are many ways to do caste. It's not that. But this thing of race, which is a new idea in the world, it entered the English language in 1570, according to Dr. Ashley Montagu in his monumental work, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. That's what I think. He said it for me. Until Wilkerson has said to me, I can't imagine anybody doing a better job of research on this question of caste. And there may be some people who can do this, but this is remarkable. I thought I knew a little bit about caste, but I don't. She has done a thorough job. She has researched everyone who's had something to say about this, from Du Bois to John Dollard, his first book I ever read on caste, and so forth. This could be the last chance for America to correct itself. I'm convinced that African Americans, a segment of Black Americans, I can't speak for all people, and a segment of human beings on this earth with beating hearts and living affections, are not going to tolerate this anymore. The other side of it is the people who are defending the system, this ideology, this secular religion, this terrible thing of punishing and killing and hurting people because you don't look like me, is close to being insane. And what I fear is when things like that die, they don't go out easy. Now, I'm sorry to say this, but this is a possibility. We may see more bloodshed than we've ever seen, because this is not going anywhere. And you have a leader who has, in effect, built a cult of personality. It has nothing to do with law, nothing to do with constitution, nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with ethics. This is, as Albert Einstein called it, a contagious disease. It's what white supremacy is. And anybody who's grounded in those kind of values, even at the emotional life, people are tired of it. You can't reason with them. And if Black people and the people of the world have said enough is enough, we've had enough of this thing going on for 400 years, you know, the white man's burden, manifest destiny, and all of that, and city on the hill, all it means the same thing. That I'm the boss of everybody and everything. And if you have an idea that I like, I can take it and make it mine and rename it and get you out of the picture. That's what happens to a lot of Black geniuses that we don't know about, the ideas that people don't know. And that's wrong. It's just wrong. I would say no human being wants to be hurt. That I know. If you can't develop a moral system around that, then we're in trouble, because there are people who are committed, who believe they have the right to hurt certain people because you don't look like me, you don't think like me, you don't walk like me, you don't shake hands the way I do. This is terrible, and the world has put up with this for the last several centuries. And I think it's the end of it. And it's not going to be easy to change this thing. The price that Black people have to pay, I can't speak for anybody else, or even Black people. I hope you don't think I'm speaking for Black people. Personally, I might know 200 or 300 Black people up close and personal. So I don't know who all these 45 million people are. I don't know them. I'm just speaking for myself. If people don't come to the fore and stand up for humanity, because the people who've made Trump their God are not going anywhere, and they're ready to die for this myth called race and white supremacy. They are ready to die and they're ready to kill. They're good at killing. That's had their way, killing everybody. Genocide has been, wherever this ideology has come, it came here and slaughtered. We don't know how many indigenous populations, but the nations that were here that no longer exist. So I'm going to get off the soapbox. I'm sorry about that, but this is serious. This is the last straw. When John Adams said that a revolution comes when the violence comes and it's a tremendous explosion, that means it's the end of the story as it has been played. That means this is the end of it, you know, that people can't tolerate anymore this business of white people calling themselves white, so-called white. He may be an idiot and don't want you to sit next to him or her. And this kind of stuff has got to stop. It's borders on a form of insanity. I think that Einstein was right. You know, it is a contagious disease. And by that I mean white supremacy, the doctrine that founded the United States of America based on a myth, which is race. I'd like to ask white people this question. How long you think you've been white? This is people, you know, white, I've been to Europe. People have never identified themselves by their skin color. That's new in the world. It's still true that the basic identity of all human beings is geography, language, and religion, most of the time, not skin color. I go to Africa, I meet people who look like me and I say I'm black, and they say, well, I'm Yoruba. What do you do? Because there's a Yoruba language, there's Yoruba customs, habits. I go to East Africa. The Luo people tell me, I'm saying I'm black. He looks just like me, but he says I'm Luo. Those Obama's people. You know, I'm Luo. I'm not, you can see I'm black, but there's a Luo land, Luo language, customs, habits, mores, beliefs, all of these things to make up the who-ness of people. It's not how you look, it's to what you are. That's crazy. How I look is not who I am, but people believe that. And they impose all of these insanities over you, that you are born to be this, that, or the other. This is learned behavior, responds to a stimuli around something called race, and it's got to go. I am not a race, I'm saying to black white people, and neither are you. End of discussion.
Thank you, Elder. Definitely appreciate your response. Dr. Tyner, I'll ask you the same question. What is the most critical and urgent message of Caste, in your opinion?
That Isabel Wilkerson gives us clarity. Oftentimes we can have a myriad of different discussions. You can say it's about class, it's about race, it's about religion, it's about gender, it's about ability, and the list can go on and on. She squarely gave us the direction that we have to deal with the infrastructure. And if our failure to do that, as Elder and Professor has outlined, is our inability to sustain ourselves as America, but it also impacts the world. She acknowledges that white supremacy is the air that we breathe. She acknowledges that it's the system. She talks about this piece that caste is really the skeletal system. And as someone who's had injuries and had to work with a chiropractor, you know that things go wrong when your skeletal system is just out of alignment a little bit. So imagine, as Elder Ramona talked about, 12,000 years of oppression, 12,000 years of destruction, and the infrastructure in that skeletal system for African Americans over 400 years here in the United States, the challenges that our Asian American brothers and sisters are facing even now with the rise of hate crimes. We know then that the skeletal structure is out of alignment. And if we jump to race immediately, we start to think about individuals. And the lawyer in me then says that we'll miss the laws and policies that keep that skeletal system out of alignment. So when I think about this in particular, as Elder has articulated, the challenge then becomes, we're tempted as individuals to look at the impact. And Professor taught me this when I was a young college student. I just wanted to fight everyone, you know, not physically. I still believed in nonviolent resistance. I was fighting with my words and getting exhausted and getting worn out. But the reality of what Professor taught me back then when I was a young Piper, a Hamlin student, was to focus not just on impact alone or intent, but look at both of them. And look at, for us as African Americans, the impact. You can see it. We have racial disparities in every quality of life indicator across the board, from healthcare to education. No matter what it is, we know that there are challenges. Marvin Gaye said it best, it makes me want to holler. But instead of hollering alone, I hope that it causes us and compels us to take action that oftentimes tangibly, once again, as a lawyer, I cannot prove the intent. Langston Hughes told us, we don't play operation. I can't look at your heart and manage and try to understand the intent, but I sure can feel and perceive and experience an impact. Unfortunately, the laws and policies don't measure impact in America either. So here we are. Isabel Wilkerson gives us that wake-up call that even Dr. King warned us about, that the most tragic thing that we can do is sleep during a revolution. Elder just told us we're in revolutionary times. So Isabel Wilkerson raised the alarm. She said, stop hitting snooze. Deal with this skeletal structure that needs to be transformed, repaired, reimagined, in many instances abolished, and let's rebuild. Let's start afresh and anew. So she gives us a common language. The book helps us not to say that someone believes it's something that just happens in the South. Someone else believes it's just what happens in the Great North and following the North Star. Isabel Wilkerson gives us clarity that this is a worldwide challenge, but she puts it squarely in America and gives us a sense of those unique, nuanced challenges. Because until I read that chapter and saw even how she compared us to Germany, and the Germans said, hold on, this may be too much. It gives us a sense that even with the Third Reich and genocide, that we are facing something very unique and different. And at the root of it is our laws and policies. So she gives us a call to action to say, let's fix this skeletal system. These bones need to be restructured, realigned, and transformed. But she also gives an example of this old house, which I can attest to, with the house built in the early 1900s. You touch one thing. Mama said she was going to remodel something. I said, please don't start. You touch one, we touch 1,000. And that's not Maya Angelou. I come as one and stand as 10,000 is negative, and it's a bunch of bills. But by using this old house example, she gives that warning that I give Mama, that once we sign that mortgage, we take on that responsibility. So Isabel Wilkerson also takes out the excuses. You can no longer say my family wasn't a slaveholding family. I didn't benefit. I don't have that much privilege. You can't say that as a white person anymore after we read this book. You can't say that, fortunately, it's someone else. You have to say squarely, this is the house. This is the Constitution. This is the laws. These are the infrastructure that we inherited. Now it's our responsibility to remodel, transform, and live up to the promises that we've outlined in our laws with equal justice under the law today. And we, as the elder said, I'll close with, we can't afford to wait.
Thank you both. Both incredible contributions. I think we all wonder if this is our last opportunity to get it right, but past generations have also thought the same thing, and we keep repeating this unfortunate history. Lissa, Jones-Lofgren, Ramona, Kitto, Stately, these next questions are for you two. I'll start with you, Lissa. Next week, it will be 1 year since George Floyd was murdered. I want to make sure people understand he didn't die, he was murdered. It's important to use that language. Was Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck America's penalty for Floyd's race, his class, or his caste?
Thank you, Myron, and thank you, everybody. I would say his class, his caste, and his race, and his race, and his race, and his race, and his place, and his gender, and his body size, and his skin color. All of it mixed together killed George Floyd. Professor Mahmoud's pamphlet, as he calls it, a book titled The Myth of Race and the Reality of Racism, teaches us that the myth of race is deadly. that is what Isabel Wilkerson talks about when she's talking about the terror of enforcement and cruelty as a measure of control. For Black people, African Americans kidnapped from their home, stolen for the purpose of labor, we've never dealt with that reality here in this country. And now the country doesn't know what to do with the people who no longer will build wealth unwillingly at the end of a gun. And that's ultimately what killed George Floyd. Isabel Wilkerson talked about the necessity of the bottom rung, that Black people are somehow cast as the very, very bottom so that you can dehumanize us to a point where you can rape, steal, maim, kill, terrorize continuously, and even kill on film. And people would say, it's the George Floyd trial, which told me exactly how confused they were. It was never the George Floyd trial, except it was, because this is the country built on caste, but it was the Derek Chauvin trial. And America is constantly wrestling with the question, how do we contain Black people? How do we take their culture and their peoplehood, but kill the people in the process? And that is what killed George Floyd. And so many, many, countless others. The poet Ashley Oliver wrote a poem she titled Blank. She said, I start out this poem and I write, such and such happened to, and I have to leave it blank. And I have to write about their mother and their father and their sister and their uncle and their contribution to the community, but I have to leave it blank because the time I write the poem, by the time the ink is dry, there's a new name in a new situation. So I have to leave it blank.
Thank you, Lissa. Same question for you, Ramona. The knee on George Floyd's neck, was it his race, class, or caste?
Thank you so much, Myron, and thank you. I'm honored to be on this panel with everyone tonight. I will have to say that it was race, class, and caste that killed and murdered George Floyd. And I say that, and I've really thought about, of course, I think all of us have thought about this, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis is front and center. And I appreciate your question during this discussion to bring it to the now, because we've read about some history and things like that. And I know there's a lot of pushback. People say this really doesn't happen. We witnessed it. We've witnessed it many, many times. I will say it's all three, but I'll say definitely race. And I think what would have happened, and for viewers, think about this. What would have happened during that scenario of 9 minutes with the knee on the neck if that were a German Shepherd? Would someone have stepped in? Would someone have said something and stopped it? Would someone have allowed that type of torture to continue on and on? And so what's the difference? Ask yourself, what is the difference? Why was it okay? In Isabel Wilkerson's story, she also talks about the concentration camps and people who were living beside them, and the crematoriums going constantly. And one of the men in the camp said, I wonder what these people outside think. Is it okay with them? He says, you know, not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. And that had just profound impact on me. And that moment when George Floyd was dying in the street, not to speak is to speak. And there are a whole lot of elements to that, but I'm sure there were many people passing by that didn't do anything. In Isabel, in this man in the concentration camp, he also said that all the people in the town weren't all Nazis. them just they believed in the opponents of the right were less than human, and it says that the townspeople swept the ash from their steps and carried on with their day. Mothers pulled their children inside, and when the wind kicked up, hurried them along to keep them from being covered in the ash of fellow human beings. And I think that can be compared to contemporary America when we say, oh, we can't really talk about race. We can't really talk about the genocide of Native people. We can't really talk about these harms because children are too young to know that. And they're not. Because if we don't teach that, we will grow another generation of people not speaking.
Thank you, Ramona. I definitely appreciate that contribution. Yeah, the ash, that was a compelling element of the book. There's an old saying about the Ku Klux Klan. And the saying is, but who cleans their uniforms? And the idea is that someone had to manufacture those uniforms. You don't see them at the store. Someone had to store them in their homes. Someone had to make sure that they were ready to go whenever it was time for them to be worn. So that's something that I thought about in reading Caste, the old saying about the Ku Klux Klan, but who cleans their uniforms? Because I think we still deal with a lot of that today. The idea that you can make an impact, an adverse impact on a group of people without being a direct participant. So that's certainly a compelling component of that book. Terri, Thao, Shannon, Gibney, definitely want to get to you two. And I'll start with you, Terri. For you, how is Caste illustrated in Minnesota?
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the question, and happy to be here tonight with everybody. I'm a policy person, so I think when Dr. Artika Tyner mentioned the disparities, the fact that Minnesota is one of the worst states for African Americans is pretty much the effect and outcomes of Caste operating, as some people may think the way it should be operating. It's operating perfectly, right? And so, and it's operating in both the public and private sphere sectors, as well as the public-private spheres, meaning narrative, right? Earlier, somebody else just mentioned now the ways, I think Ramona talked about when we don't acknowledge, but in Minnesota, this concept of Minnesota nice, don't rock the table, right? That's this powerful narrative. When I'm at policy tables, don't bring that up. We don't want to talk about the disparities. It's a little unnerving, and that becomes a way in which it becomes reinforced. Like we don't want to acknowledge the things that are actually happening. Right now at the Capitol, I understand there's a couple bills that are being entirely held up because they want to do some set-asides for people of color communities, but Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And so Caste is all the time, I think the book illustrates how it gets further complex and complicated. And that's how the system of laws and policies that Artika spoke to are working too, layering on top of each other. I also want to say in my last comment about how Caste is illustrated is that dangerously, many non-Black people of color are starting to believe that as long as they're not on this bottom rung, as Isabel Wilkerson speaks, then it's okay, right? And so as long as I don't live in the hood anymore, as long as I make more than poverty level, but just a little bit more, then my circumstances are better off. And I think these questions of anti-Blackness are questions many communities are starting to have. And I applaud a lot of the amazing organizers in those non-Black people of color communities who are having these intentional conversations. But that is truly, to me, how Caste gets illustrated in Minnesota in many different ways.
Thank you so much, Terri, for saying that. Shannon, same question for you. How is Caste illustrated here in Minnesota?
Thank you, Myron, and everybody. It's a fantastic panel. Great to be here with you all tonight. I kind of have a different take on the book. I actually had a lot of problems with the book. So this framework of Caste, the way that she was juxtaposing the Indian system of caste, which has been around for 4,000 years, I felt like she presented it as this sort of fixed ahistorical system that actually has changed a lot through those 4,000 years. And a lot of Indian critics have also taken issue with that part of the book, and also the framing of there was a lot of interesting, the parts of the book that dealt with Nazi Germany as well, and some comparisons to some of the strategies that they used there to increase white supremacy policies, white supremacist policies and whatnot. That was fascinating. But there were also some problems with that. So I would not use the term caste. I also feel like anytime that we're, I would use systemic racism. Yeah, that's the phrase that I'm going to use. And when we talk about racism, we have to talk about capitalism, which is another thing that's not mentioned one time in the book, which is another thing that I have a problem with. And then, gets to, I know, a later question that you're going to ask us, Myron, about, the sort of end of the book and what Wilkerson comes to in terms of what we should do about caste. So I think Terri has done a fantastic job of outlining, as well as my other esteemed panelists, the stakes of systemic racism and the outcomes in Minnesota, right? And the fact that we continually have some of the worst, if not the worst, racial disparities in the country between Black folks and white folks, and Native folks and white folks. And when I moved to Minnesota about 17 years ago, and it was interesting, talking to white folks then about this fact, this myth of Minnesota nice, right? The mythology, the public discourse, the narrative. And most white people back then would be like, it's not, they would get mad, right? Minnesota's great. It's great for education. It's great for, jobs. Jobs are great here, and healthcare is great. And whenever I would say, yes, if you're white, it's great, they would get very angry. And then I felt like, maybe 5 or 10 years later, the business community came in and was like, oh my God, if we don't actually start graduating BIPOC students at a much higher rate, like this Minnesota miracle that everybody touts, as far as, having all these Fortune 500 companies here and being one of the richest states in the country, like that's going to tank, So we need to do so. And then all the data started coming in, right? And to me, it's sort of analogous to like the George Floyd situation and this like plethora of videos that are, coming out because we have the technology now, right? Black folks been saying, and BIPOC folks, Native folks have been saying forever that this has been going on, but you can't believe us until you have the data or there's a video, right? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Shannon. Yeah, I found myself wondering, certainly if this should be the first book that people read as they're trying to understand some of these issues. And I think the Minnesota nice element, I think we've all experienced that to some degree. And people, I think, like to talk about the South and how different parts of the country are. And for me, my family grew up in the South, and we would go take trips to Mississippi. And I remember my uncle telling me and all my cousins, you can go wherever you want to go, just don't go past 9th Street. We said, well, why not? Well, white folks live over there. We don't go over there, they don't come over here. And it was sort of a startling thing to hear, but it was real. I mean, it was how they talked about race in that part of the country. It wasn't hidden. It was out in the open. And I think perhaps what happened a year ago, some of these things are now out in the open in Minnesota, but this is new for a lot of people, sort of this blunt conversation about these issues that we have been discussing for so long. Back to Dr. Tyner, Elder Mahmoud. I'll start with you, Elder. I really want to know your thoughts on this. In your opinion, what makes the caste system in America unique?
I think this modern myth of race more than anything, and then caste is not necessarily based on what we call race, which is a new idea in the world. I think that the central thing, and I don't know enough about Indian caste system, but I did have a teacher who spent their life studies, and there are hundreds of castes, not just black and white and red and so forth. Those are new things in the world. And I think that the unique thing about the United States of America in terms of dealing with the human weight and complexity of life is this thing of race was almost a godsend to people who were trying to build a new nation state. All of the states in the New World are nation states. They're not like traditional nations of Native Americans go back hundreds, thousands of years, never had a flag or anything. They're nations. The nations are created one or two ways by history itself. It evolves like the nations in the Bible, like the state of the Jewish people. That was a nation. Nation states are relatively a modern phenomenon, which grows up in the modern world. It goes back no farther than the Magna Carta in 1215, where you started and writing governments on paper. The United States was created about 242 years ago. The land was here. It was created by a piece of paper imposed on land between the Atlantic and the Mississippi Valley. There was no American nation. But there were Navajo nations, there were Miami nations, there were Alabama nations. These are all once people. Some of them don't even exist anymore. There are Tuscarora nations and so forth. And the very idea of the United States of America came from Native American people in the Six Nations of the northeastern part of the country. The Federation, where women were very prominent, only they could call war. They participated in what we call now democratic discourse. It was a John, the old man, Quaker, the oldest man in the revolution, 81 years old. So we either live like fools or die like fools. Help me with that. He was known as a Quaker, but he's not a Quaker. It was Benjamin Franklin, I'm sorry. Benjamin, who knew everything, and he certainly was a brilliant man. But he studied Native American people, and he brought that idea. There's, the United States of America is a new idea. It never existed in Europe. You couldn't never form a union until after the United States was established. The European Union is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's like copying off its kid. The United States got the idea of a federation from Native American people. I want to get that on board because it's very important. Race is a central organizing principle, of the United States of America. Let's start with the first article, Section 3 of the American Constitution. It says, I'm not making this up, you can go read it yourself, that Black people were defined as 3/5 of other persons. It's a very clever way of doing that. They weren't people, they were part people and part property. That's the first. Slavery was old when the world was young. Nobody had, in Greece, people weren't property. You own the labor of the people, not the people. Alexander the Great was taught by a slave, if you will. This is something totally new, erasure of a people's humanity as human beings. 3/5 of a man, a troublesome species of property, said George Washington of Black people. What do you mean, species of property? That's new in the world. The whole thing of American slavery, New World slavery, is radical in the history of slavery. Scholars know this. They need to talk about that more. So race is a central organizing principle. And in fact, it erases the humanity of people by putting them in a caste system at the base of the pyramid. Is where Black people are, and people have places, and most people don't know this caste of, look at what's phenomenal about this period of politics is that You have a man who's once the president of the United States, whose father gave him $1 million to start his career, right? Who could have predicted that he would be the leader of the people among white people who are most conspicuously racist in their behavior? That's what politics can do, the impossible. It's expanding its reach, and I'm sorry that I took all that time. I'm really sorry about that.
No, don't be sorry, Elder. It was, you always have time.
Well,
Dr. Tyner, go ahead, Elder.
oh,
Okay,
Yeah.
Dr. Tyner,
Oh.
same question, Dr. Tyner. What makes the caste system in America unique, in your opinion?
I think Elder laid it out. The reality, until I met Elder, I didn't have an understanding of my history and the context as it touched the caste system, or understanding of who I was, where I was headed, and what I could do. So as Elder had pointed out, a big challenge for America is one, an ignorance gap. I remember the first time I called Professor on the phone, I was struggling. I'm like, Professor, I'm sharing everything you taught me, but no one knows what I'm talking about. And he said, well, you have to first fight the ignorance gap. And I thought, ignorance gap, what exactly does that mean? I knew the definition of the word, but he talked about how I had a responsibility to create and disseminate knowledge. That's one of the reasons why I became a professor after Dr. Mahmoud, because I watched what he was able to do by shaping a narrative, giving us understanding. I still debate with people who try to give me an understanding. For instance, I remember being in a business meeting and someone told me redlining never existed. I said, well, then how could you be a banker? How could you be sitting here in an area? And the irony of it was that was known because of redlining, that the University of Minnesota students were working indirectly to remove restrictive covenants. Oh, you just don't understand. Actually, I do. I understand that maybe you should pay tuition and join me at St. Thomas, and we can talk about history. We can lay this out, and then we can start a debate. As a lawyer, I can't debate someone without basic understanding. I look as irrational as they do. So I've had to learn the hard way, and I've called Professor so many times. He probably gets tired of taking my calls. How do I bridge this ignorance gap? And America is very unique that we try to rewrite history. We try to revise it. We tear out chapters. And with our laws, and I always tell my students, law is a language of power. And I was determined to become well-versed in it, to be able to fight in this battle for justice and freedom of my people. And when I look at that specifically, people go, well, are you just talking about Black people? Yes, it's a part of that answer. But I'm talking about all people so we can have clarity and understanding. The professor told me to go back, find my roots. That's how I found myself in Ghana time and time again, sitting at the feet of Dr. Ayesu, who was trying to teach us and give us a deeper understanding at the Ghana Center that explores slavery, that this caste system in America is uniquely different. I said, well, why, Dr. Ayesu? What do I need to understand? He said, well, you have to think about the fact that when I'm talking about slavery, I'm talking not about it in the same way of caste. I'm talking about it in the sense of production and support, and depending on the nature. See this is radically different. Could you see a white person saying I'm a part of their family? Watch what Dr. Ayesu taught me. That the slavery of the reality of the ancient tribes of Ghana meant then that oftentimes if someone did not have children, you're then engrafted into that lineage so their lineage could continue to grow. Name African Americans that are engrafted into the lineage of white families. It didn't happen in our caste system because our caste system was about, by law and policy, making African Americans chattel, less than property. Hence why that's why Elder Ramona could do that comparison between a German shepherd that gets more respect than a Black man or a Black woman and more preservation around life. So when you think about that, we have to have a radically different conversation because we have a different set of factors, and we have an ever evolving and expanding ignorance gap that doesn't even allow us to engage with the issues at hand. So when I think about that, my hope is, my inspiration is that we can bridge that gap with knowledge and facts, not sentiments, not what someone told you. As lawyers, we call that hearsay, but getting deep into our history and getting a better understanding So Sister Lissa just told us, if you haven't read Professor's book, you should be reading, in addition to Caste, you should be reading The Myth of Race. In addition to The Myth of Race, you should be reading Einstein on Race and Racism. You should be reading Jenna McNeil's book, Groundwork, to understand the legal structure and the systems that Charles Hamilton Houston used to radically transform our nation. You should be reading books like Blind Spot that give us the science behind this idea, what infuses caste in our minds. That blind spot helps us to understand that in our minds, we're taught, and early studies show as early as 3 months old, we start to see manifestations around race bias. It's building up before a child even reaches kindergarten. They know, and they start to put attributes of what's good, what's bad, what's evil, what's competent, what's rich, what's poor, who matters and who doesn't. So the biggest thing about America is our ignorance gap that Professor taught me about nearly 3 decades ago, to start asking questions on how do we change it. And the first person that we have to take control over is ourselves, to no longer allow ourselves to swim in and bask in. We hold it as a badge of honor, our ignorance. We're happy about it. And I hope as an educator that I'm able to challenge this day by day and moment by moment.
Thank you, Dr. Tyner. I really appreciate that. I love that there's so many incredibly smart people on this panel. And a lot of people ask me why a book club. And to Dr. Tyner's point, because we can't have any tangible conversations about these issues unless you're educated. Unless you are committed to learning, then we really can't make any progress in conversing about these issues. For Lissa, Jones-Lofgren, and Ramona, Kitto, Stately, I have a third. I was going to ask you the second question that I sent, but I want to ask you this question instead, Lissa. What makes you hopeful after reading Caste?
I think that after being in the industry of trying to include people for more than 20 years, I think that she gives us a new language, something that is emergent. I think the ideas of equity and inclusion and diversity and racism and all those things have been so convoluted, even white supremacy, you know? I mean, Zora Neale Hurston said, if you ain't got it, you ain't got it. And if you got it, you can't hide it. And then people just don't really understand. And so they've muddied the terms. And Isabel gives us a new way to talk about it, like Dr. Tyner said. If you liken it to an old house, if you liken it to the inventory you do when things mature over time, those are the kind of inventories and interrogatories Isabel calls us to. And I think ultimately, no one's going to write the perfect book about this beast that's been existing for, in Ramona's words, 12,000 years. And think about something people have been up against for 12,000 years. I mean, talk about developing a muscle against something for 12,000 years, trying to get it off of your neck, trying to just do what comes natural to do. And so when I look to the future, I think about our children who are refusing, in elders' words, this current paradigm. Langston Hughes, Negroes, sweet, meek, docile, and kind. Beware the day they change their mind. Young people have said, that's it, we're done with it. And their parents have said it too. So Isabel has given us a new language with which to fight. Like Dr. Tyner said, I may not want to box, but I do want to box with my words, and I do want to box in debate, because that will change things. And I credit this book club and the writings of Isabel Wilkerson with giving me a new language with which to teach and to understand and to learn and digest what has been happening to me and people who look like me for more than 4 centuries. Thank you, Myron.
I want to follow up real quick. Listen, do we have a responsibility to find that hope?
To find out.
Yes.
To find the hope, to search for that hope. Do we have a responsibility to attach ourselves to some sense of hope, even in these dark times?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's we're the best hope for American democracy. If Black people give up, then we are really finished. I think Martin King said it best about some times in the future they'll live with great people, the Black people who injected new life into the veins of democracy. We're at that precipice. I think we can't give up. We must be incurably optimistic about this thing. We've been through enough to know that. Human beings are tough, period. And we are among the toughest, the most enduring people God ever put on this earth. And I think if America has a chance, all it has to do is respect human beings as human beings. No human being is supposed to look exactly like another human being. That would be crazy. Groups or whatever you want to call races of people. And it's so new in the world that people have been racist. The Homo sapiens hadn't been on Earth that long to create something like a race, like a pure race. People are too traversed for that. They have been too many places and spaces. How do you explain the relationship between this continent and Africa and seafaring, who built the same kind of boats in Africa that they built in South America? We don't nearly know enough about this. We're talking about the last 400 or 500 years of history in which this phenomenon from the Western Peninsula of Asia and a couple of islands farther west evolved into some people we call Europeans, and hence white people who didn't know they were white until they came to America and Australia and the Oceania and the islands and so forth. You don't have to be a genius to figure out how people arrived at that politically. Race is essentially not a human personality. It is a political reality. It's not human or personal. It's political. Its only meaning is political. And we've used something like skin color and facial features and the way people are built and so forth as a handle to hang stuff on. You know, I want to say something else about, there was a time when pseudoscience was in charge of everything before pseudoscience was overthrown. You could take the same principle that you use around race, like skin color and so forth, and attach certain things to it about people's behavior and so forth, and claim that they behave a certain way because of the way they look. It got so darn bad that you could tell whether a person was in the 1920s, that recent, early 30s, social science, you could tell whether a person was criminally inclined or not by how much hair he had on his body. You could tell whether he is likely to be a criminal or backward or something by whether or not he had a crooked teeth and so forth. That's called, it's just like race thinking. That's what race, there's a race thinking. The last thing I want to say about this is that the idea of race comes from the intelligentsia of Europe. It wasn't born in America, it was brought here. This piece of names like the Comte de Gouverneur. People don't know that name, but he wrote Races, the Inequality of Races. He was a French intellectual in the 1700s. Foundations of the 19th century. Those are precursors to the idea of race, and they were evolving, but at the same time, the exploration and imperialism was evolving. So you can't explain racism without capitalism, capitalism without racism. You can't do that. They go together. Now, I just made in many people's mind, unpardonable sin by linking racism to capitalism. I can't unlink it. I don't know how you do that. Jefferson and Washington and Madison was nothing but agricultural capitalists before the Industrial Revolution took over. They were the pre-industrialists, exploiting labor of the people replaced by the labor of machines. Black people were in effect machines that built this economy. $4 billion.
Elder, I want to make sure we get to the other panelists. I appreciate it, but I want to make sure we had a limited time. I wanted to go back to Lissa quickly here about the question I asked earlier, just sort of this, do we have a responsibility? Because I think about that. Do we have a responsibility to find that sense of optimism that Elder Mahmoud talked about?
I don't think we have a choice. Dr. Joseph White, who founded the field of Black psychology in Ebony magazine in 1970, talked about the 7 resiliencies of Black folk. And one of them is the ability to bounce back from a setback, to heal it from the broken places. That's what Black people can teach everybody in this country. It's the whole idea that we know our way toward freedom. And we are calling everyone else in this country to go forward and claim your culture and your peoplehood and all the things that are right about you. And we owe it to ourselves to maintain the hope that our ancestors sowed, because they kept hope, Myron. We have to keep it too.
Ramona, I keep thinking about the 12,000 years, remark. So I'm really interested in your response to this question. What made you hopeful, if anything, after reading Caste about the future?
Hi, Myron. Okay, so what makes me hopeful? I just want to reiterate the 12,000 years is how long my people have lived here, even though in the state of Minnesota, in the last 160 years, it's against the law for me to live here. I mean, that's how ludicrous this idea is. Also, you can't place race on a nation. We are a nation within a nation. Our native nations are. So there is this gap of ignorant gap, I heard. So what gives me hope? Over 800 people here tonight. 800 people who I hope have read the book, who have gained some understanding, who are willing to humble yourself to maybe a different way of knowing. It's important because, we have these value systems that are all over America that, gosh, if we admit to something we don't know, we're weak. So thank you for showing the courage to the people in the audience for being here and being willing to have a conversation. Number 2, for Dakota people, we had a word for the white guys. We called them noreshni, which is like they have no ears because they don't listen. And when you are learning something new, you have to start in a place where you listen. And so that's also humbling yourself to listen to and considering a different narrative, because all of this history that we hear is made up. We have thousands of years of history. So what gives me hope is so many people here. What gives me hope is that people are willing to read this book or whatever book they're ready for. I personally thought that the narrative, giving all the different narratives, kind of brings people's guard down so they can listen. It's not something that we find grown-ups do. But not only just being here, what gives me hope is the fact that now that you know, you can't unknow. And so what are you going to do? You can't just keep this information. You have to take action. And that's where their learning really happens, because then it unfolds. This story unfolds 10 times every day. Keep a journal, write it down, tell your children. If you can't have a conversation with your adult sister and brothers for fear of retribution, have it with your children. They deserve it. And everyone deserves that.
Thank you, Ramona. I really appreciate it. And I want to emphasize again, with this panel, these people are here, these are people who live right here. And I think we're just so lucky to have this wealth of knowledge and experience. I think there are a lot of people who assume that people started talking after George Floyd was murdered, but these are the same conversations that have been happening in the state of Minnesota for decades and decades. Terri, I want to go to you and then Shannon. What should we tell our children or the next generation about America's caste system, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's this wonderful meme floating around on the internet, Facebook, it's something like, if a child's young enough to experience racism, then they're old enough to talk about it. And I certainly, so I'm butchering it, sorry to the original creator of that quote. But if they're, and I certainly remember being a young child and really understanding difference among people, right? And so that's like one of the first things you learn, what's alike, what's different. And so, but then I'm appreciative of teachers who give it more context too. So they're talking about this stuff. I'm a parent, so I have a 5th grader and a 7th grader, and they are talking about this stuff at school. They cannot, the murder of George Floyd is not something that they're shying away from. They're being realistic about. My 10-year-old talked about racism the other day, and I was just simply amazed because even at that elementary level, they are having these conversations. What I would tell them is that things are not fair, right? And what made them fair is both within our control and historically beyond our control. So for the things we can control, we can learn to treat each other with dignity and kindness and speak up when injustice occurs, when someone's not being treated fairly. Children have a very innate sense of that because, they're used to being told things aren't fair. But I also think we also have to explain to them what's beyond our control and be really clear about history and narrative, but where that can change too, and where we are in position to do that. So if I did, so this is what I'm literally telling my children about the caste system, and I think it's something we can tell all of our kids.
Terri, I want to follow up to what you said, because I think it's a very important point. What would you tell your child or any child if they said, well, does that mean if it can be created, it can also be dismantled? How would you respond to that?
I would say yes. And we have to be very intentional, right? And so intentional, meaning we read books that help teach us about the difference. Intentional that when we hear the word race and it makes us uncomfortable, we have to be okay and sit in the discomfort. We have to ask ourselves why. We're not going to have answers right away. And to explain the complexities, because we do a disservice, I think, to children when we aren't explaining the complexities.
Thank you very much. Shannon, I'll start with you. What should we tell our children, or the next generation, about America's caste system?
I mean, the truth. We have to tell our children the truth, especially about the things that hurt. And the problem with most humans is that the truth can be very painful, intergenerationally and individually. And it can be very complicated. We can be complicit. We're all complicit in systems of oppression. And I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it's just so interesting how often I see them pick up on things that adults don't necessarily think that they are ready for or can process or should be processing or whatnot. And so, yeah, things have to be developmentally appropriate, but they know what's going on. I remember on Twitter, after the insurrection, the white supremacist insurrection at the Capitol, and there was a tweet by a prominent kidlit writer who happens to be a white woman, and she's like, yes, I'm getting all these questions about how should I talk to my kids about what happened? Should I talk to my kids about what happened? And I was like, that is a white question. That is because if you're a Black parent or a BIPOC, a Native, you have to talk about this stuff with your kids to keep them safe, right? Or the illusion that you can keep them safe, right? But we have to talk, and they're going to talk about it with you. My kids, it's like we live, 8-10 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. It's alive. It's here and now. And also with the truth, I think comes admitting we don't have all the answers. If racism was easy to solve, we would have solved it already. If systemic oppression, racism can only exist because, it interlocks, right, with classism, homophobia, sexism, nationalisms, all these things, right? So when we're talking about race, we're talking about all this other stuff too. I'll leave it there.
I want to follow up, Shannon, because we've had some email exchanges. I wrestled in this book with the idea comparing Nazi Germany and that caste system and what happened compared to America's. I felt like some of the comparisons were maybe too convenient and simple. And I'm curious your thoughts on that portion of Isabel Wilkerson's book, but also overall, what was the book missing in your opinion?
Yeah, I think Wilkerson is a beautiful writer. I mean, she can write a sentence. The woman is gifted, and anybody who's read The Warmth of Other Suns, I called her in my book, I led a book club discussion also about caste, and, I called her relentless. Like her cataloging of white supremacy, right? Like in American history and in the American South is just like, it's just like this bludgeon, right? I mean, you can't, it's so effective, right? But I'm not the only person who sort of has this issue, and I'm going to drop this article into the chat now so that people can check it out if they want. But the book has been really well received in the publishing industry. It's won prestigious awards, right? People are reading and talking about it, and I think in one sense, anytime that there's sort of like this emerging and growing discussion about race in America, it's good. I had a problem with sort of the foundational ideas of the piece, which basically what I took from it was her central argument was that race is not a good framework for discussing these inequities in American society. Caste is a better one. And I felt like theoretically, she did not set that up well in the book. She did not prove that argument at all for me in the book. And some of it has to do with the issue of racial capitalism, which I talked about. But, I always tell my students, let's go to the text for a minute. Let's see what the text actually says, right? So 383 here, she says, to imagine an end to caste in America, we need only look at the history of Germany. It is living proof that if a caste system, the 12-year reign of the Nazis, can be created, it can be dismantled. We make a serious error when we fail to see the overlap between our country and others, the common vulnerability in human programming, what the political theorist Hannah Arendt called, quote, the banality of evil. Right? And this is in a very short epilogue, right? Where she's just like, okay, this is what we can do about caste, right? She set up this whole thing. And it's like, also for me, she's taking this structural system, this argument about the structural system called caste. And most of the book, she's making these very individual arguments. She's talking about these things that happen to people that she knows, her experiences, all this, it feels very random, So I actually disagree with some esteemed members of our panel, although I really enjoy critical dialogue and exchange. I did not find the book to be well put together or necessarily like the basis was not good. But basically, I don't know if anybody here keeps up with things in Germany, but Germany has a very vitriolic and alive white supremacist faction of their population. Political parties, right? That are like, they're there. They're challenging things like now, right? And in this article that I dropped in the chat, this writer is talking about the German genocide that occurred over 100 years ago in Namibia, right? Which Germany colonized and tried to colonize. And, in that in that genocide, Germany, you know, Germans murdered the Herero Nama people. And so just 1 week before, this is from the article that I put in there, Caste was published exactly 1 week before Namibia officially rejected a nearly $12 million offer that Germany had made in compensation for its genocide of Herero Nama peoples over a century ago. Okay, Namibia rejected the offer not only because the sum was insulting, but also because Germany, caste exemplar for a society that has overcome caste system, has refused to apologize, having only recently even named the murder of close to 100,000 Herero and Nama people a genocide. Adding insult to injury, Germany refuses to name the offer as reparations, instead calling it compensation aimed at, quote, healing the wounds. This too raises questions about caste and its implications. If reparations by another name are not reparations, what is the cost of a name? Okay, so I mean, I don't want to take up a lot more time with it, but you know, that's a problem, right? I mean, I just think that sort of having this, again, ahistorical narrative of sort of like, well, Germany is now this racially equitable, multicultural, anti-racist, whatever you want to call it, society. It's just not true. And I just feel like Wilkerson, again, going back to my argument about, you know, the illusion of capitalism in this, she could have come up with some more really hardcore structural suggestions for how to deal, if she really believes that caste is a better measure of systemic racial inequalities in the United States. If she had looked at, for instance, the tradition of Black radical thought and Black Marxist thought, like focusing on materialisms and systems, she could have come up with a much better sort of diagnosis of what needs to happen to change it, instead of everybody needs to be nicer to everyone else.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate that. And I know we had talked, so I'm glad you said that, because I wanted you to share. I know you had some thoughts that maybe some of us didn't have, but I also think that's what I want this book club to be. We're not always going to agree on what we read. It's about learning and growing. And I think as writers, you know, we all have written one time or another. We all write, you know, maybe for our careers. And I was reading the book thinking, okay, what were the digestible elements of this book, where it's like, you want to sell books, that's the goal, you know, and there are barriers to that, as we all know, sort of in the literary world. And I would love to talk to Isabel Wilkerson about, okay, what were the things that you wished you would have included, or maybe, you know, were edited out of the book? So I think those are all important questions. I want to say before we go to our questions, because I think that's important to get to people. I think there are about 40, well, maybe 20 questions or so. I just want to thank everybody before we get to that portion. We just had nearly 900 people at its peak, I think, in a discussion about a book in a book club in Minnesota that's named after a slave, a former slave, right? So I think that's incredible. And it's not everything, you know, I don't take these moments and assume that we've overcome, but I do think it is a sign of what can happen. And I just hope people stay attached to the book club, get the newsletter. We'll have more panels, more discussions with our next books. But this is really cool to see those numbers of individuals who on a Tuesday could be doing a whole lot of things in May in Minnesota, but decided to join us and just to listen to this conversation. It was an incredible conversation. I'm so glad everyone joined us. I'm so thankful and grateful for the panelists who have participated. So I want to go to Alexis, because it looks like we have some questions that we're supposed to, and I'll say this, when it comes to the questions, let's try to keep our answers, you know, 1 to 2 minutes, just because there are a lot of questions. We got a lot of panelists, and I want to give people an opportunity to make sure that they can all respond. So Alexis, are you going to read off the questions here? The first question?
Yes, I am. So the first first question is, do the Palestinians live in a caste system too?
Do what?
The
Palestinians.
Palestinians. Why don't we start with Shannon, and then we'll go from there.
Question.
Yes,
Shannon, we'll start with you.
yes, absolutely. The Palestinians. Palestinians are like some of the most oppressed people on the planet. And I mean, we can see this in what's happening right now. I mean, it's just blowing up right now. And I mean, essentially, I mean, also people who are, you know, I know the sort of designation of refugee is a, you know, that's a political designation. Not everybody agrees, but people who've been run off their land, that's a whole other category of disenfranchisement. You know, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but my answer would be yes, definitely.
Ramona, what do you think about that?
I think that all groups of people tend to try and build a hierarchical structure. And so, yes, absolutely, I agree with Shannon, but I think that kind of, well, I don't understand it because my people don't come from that kind of spiritual philosophy about community. But it does seem to be this hierarchical system of supremacy, who's better and who's not as good. So I think it happens when people gather, unfortunately.
I want to get to as many as, thank you for those contributions. I want to get to as many as we can. So I'll probably just ask a couple of panelists to respond to each question, if that's okay. Alexis, you have the next question?
Yes, I do. So the next question is, what do we do now?
Very important question. I'll start with Elder Mahmoud on that question. What do we do now?
We don't have much of a choice. We're going to keep on doing what we're doing as a people who struggle against oppression. You know, the lessons have already been laid out. You know, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Frederick Douglass taught us that people who want freedom without thunder and lightning want the rain without the awful roar of its mighty waters, and so forth. Yeah, we've been handed as a people, this peculiar people in this complex called Americans, descendants of Africans, and as we say it, descendants of Native Americans, descendants of Europeans are all embodied in the Black experience. But the only part that counts, it seems, as the African ancestry, and that's the source of the problem, and that's what the state has been built around. We've inherited a struggle, and we must maintain the struggle. If we do nothing else, we should keep on doing what we're doing. And in the end, we're going to win. People can laugh and do whatever they want, but this struggle is a righteous struggle. The world knows it's right. All the Black people are struggling for is the right to be who they are, and that's a human being. And that's what this country has denied Black people, the right to be human beings. We've been called everything but the child of God. So struggle, and when people struggle, they learn, they create consciousness, they develop new ideas, they even create new vocabularies. And that's what we're fighting. I'd like to kind of end it with this thing. Jimmy Baldwin again helps us a lot as to where we are now. He told white America and Black America, he talked to both of us, said that the world is not white. It is not Black either. The future of this world belongs to everyone. And that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which cannot now bear the weight of reality. That's what we're trapped in. A vocabulary created by the doctrine of white, and it means everything, all of the institutions and everything around it, all of the laws and so forth. That's who we are. And it said, this vocabulary said that if you're not white, especially the Black people, you're not a fully fleshed human being. And that's a bold-faced lie. And we have to challenge that. So I say, like the old folks came saying, keep on doing what you do. Do what the Spirit, in our best words, do what the Spirit say do. Keep struggling, and we will win.
Dr. Tyner, thank you, Elder Mahmoud. Dr. Tyner, same question for you. What do we do now? Also, I want to add to that. I wonder who the we is in that question.
Well, I would say the we is all of us. And the we will take all of us to help to address the complexity of the issues that we face right now. And if I think about what do, we first acknowledge the process of discourse. Like even I just think the general nature of the last few moments, it's a working assumption that everyone else agrees with the book Caste and that Professor Gibney is bringing up some of the challenges. But I have some challenges too, because you don't resolve this issue of talking about caste with just simply saying we need more radical empathy. That alone won't save us from the violence, from the oppression, from the marginalization. So I think we also, what do we do now? We need some maturity. We have to understand that even for African Americans, we're not one monolithic voice. We don't agree with each other on everything, but have the right level of maturity where we can come back to the table, engage and build again and come back again and come back again, because the reality of it is America has become something that we cannot fully understand through a lens of democracy, through a lens of law and policy. If we say that we believe in equity, if we believe in justice and freedom, we have to create the type of mechanisms where we can come back to the table, agree to disagree and build again, and have the maturity to come back to the table over and over again. We've come to worship all the divergences in our lives, politically, religion, whatever it is, fill in the blank. But now is the time of where can we find a convergence? So for me, the greatest challenge that I see of what do we do now, especially after reading this book just focuses primarily on the interpersonal pieces. It gets us past the emotional nature that most people try to avoid when they're talking about structural racism. But in my research, I help to move us further. There's 4 stages that we have to go through. We have to go through the interpersonal. What are those biases? What are those constructs? What are those prejudices that we worship and we adore, as the professor talked about? They're so close to us, we can't even identify it. We then have to go to the interpersonal pieces. What are our relationships with each other? That's the maturity piece I was just talking about. And then we have to get to the organizational pieces. How do we make the organizations, as Terri talked about, of this idea about equity, about parity, about justice manifesting? But last but not least, we also have to grapple with this as a societal level. So my greatest critique of the book is that the book took one dimension, and we have to operationalize all 4 of these things constantly and fluidly in order to bring forth change. So what do we do now? Bring forth change at each of those levels and hold ourselves accountable and be comfortable with the ability to disagree. And one of my mentors talks about it, Chairman John Hope Ryan. And one of the things that I really work on, he's the founder of Operation Hope. He said, no matter what the disagreement is, try to work towards leaving your opponent with dignity. Oh, isn't it a hard task? But how can we then have the possibility of being open to learning, being open to growing, open to being wrong, open to expanding, all simultaneously at once? How do we give that dignity as a gift and share it with others?
That's an incredible thought. How do we share that with others? I've just learned so much. I'm just so glad to be a part of this. Alexis, can we go to the next question?
Yes, we can. So on page 238, Wilkerson points out that, quote, no one wants to be in last place, end quote. Given that the caste system is ingrained in our society and all citizens, Black, white, and brown, act on it, is this a human nature versus choice? And if so, can we ever hope to be rid of it?
Let's go to Lissa with that question. Can we ever hope to get rid of it? Lissa?
That's a really very deep question. I suppose to Terry's point earlier, I guess if we give up the necessity of the bottom rung, but if history is any indicator, to Ramona's point, I doubt it. for the purpose of power, Derek Bell talked about the permanence of racism. We are a society that is built on property. That is why we value buildings over bodies. So if Lake Street burns, we have a lot to say, but if people are dead, we don't have much to say, depending on if they have a driver's license or their mother was married or whatever the criteria are to be a good Black person in the world, which I still eludes me after 52 years, I admit. But nonetheless, I don't know. I don't know. As long as we have the necessity for a bottom rung, as long as power requires an oppressed and an oppressor, I don't know. I don't know that we've ever lived in a society that doesn't require that. To Ramona's point, I think we have a lot to learn from the cultures we have squashed and tried to erase. Perhaps that's the reason that they have been squashed and erased, is primarily to not come up against these Western ideas of insanity, in the words of Einstein.
Terri, same question for you. Can we get rid of it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's got to be intentional. But I think of, I come from the Hmong community is from collective cultures, is that we're only as good as the weakest members, right? The ones who are not doing as well off. So if we were to flip it and say, why are they at the bottom rung? In my community, there is this perception sometimes around orphan children or women who are divorced, actually. There's still a lot of patriarchy in my community. So why, for us in working on this, we're saying, instead of ostracizing them, why are they there? What are the conditions that put them there? And how do we lift it up? Because if they're at that role, just as we put them there by a construct, we can be intentional and put them out of there too.
I appreciate that. Alexis, next question.
Yeah.
Alexis, do we have the next question?
Oh, sorry, the microphone didn't click off. The next question is, please make a recommendation for a first book for someone that is suffering from the ignorance gap. I have a friend who has told me there is no such thing as systematic racism, and I would like to prove some suggestions for him.
Before I go I'll go to Shannon and Ramona. But I have to say that is a question that I think all of us at one point have faced, and probably have faced many times. This idea that what we're speaking of isn't real. Shannon, what would you say to someone who said, "What do I read to prove that systemic racism is a real thing?"
I mean, there's been a whole cottage industry that sort of popped up after the murder of George Floyd. And there's like a ton of books. Actually, I think it was like the most books by Black authors ever were on the national bestseller list, which is both good and bad, for many weeks last summer. And one that I read and found was really, and I ran a book club with like a neighborhood group, and I think people, including myself, found it really useful to get some terminology and definitions around some of these basic concepts. Is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. So that's a really good one. There's another one, White Supremacy and Me. And that one is like, people take like a year to get through that one, because she has exercises that you do in that one and in your daily life. And that one people really like. Also, My Grandmother's Hands. That's another one that people read very slowly, because that's looking at sort of like the schematics of race, or in other words, how does race and racism show up in our bodies? And it shows up differently depending on where you fall in the matrix, right? It shows up differently in white bodies and Black bodies. And that's by Resmaa Menakem. So, there's so much out there, but those are three that I know a lot of people are reading right now and finding useful.
Ramona, before I go to you, for all of the panelists, if you want to put that first book in the chat, I'll read off that list as well. If you have a book that you would like to recommend. But Ramona, what would you tell someone who said, hey, I don't know if systemic racism is real, where would you have them start?
Yeah, and that is a wonderful comment for this book club and for all of the people to hear somebody actually be brave and courageous enough to admit that. If we look at our K-12 system of education, it has not changed for over 100 years. Now, just imagine the wonderful things we have witnessed in technology and ways of moving forward in 100 years, and understand our system of education has not changed. So this person who says, I don't believe it exists, is probably telling the total truth, because K-12 education is geared to create pride in white students. It does not talk about Black students. It does not talk about equity. It does not talk about true history. So what I would say is really important is to read a book that any one of us recommends. Read books not written by white people who are trying to interpret the lens of Blacks and people of color, but read from people who actually have those lived experiences. And there's no shortage of them, but start somewhere. Start somewhere.
Thank you, Ramona. And I hope, this book club can be that start for a lot of people. I guess what I found with Minnesotan sort of the passive aggressive nature is, you can walk up to them and have some of these conversations and they might be like, well, I don't know, but they'll read the book. I mean, Minnesotans love reading, so they'll read the book and enjoy it. And then they'll have a conversation after that. Lissa recommended another book, Langston Hughes, The Ways of White Folks. There are just so many books. Dr. Tyner recommended Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Derek Bell, and Here I Stand by the great Paul Robeson. There are just so many incredible books out there. I think it starts with a desire to just learn and to read. And I think once you start, it sort of piques your interest. And then you kind of go on that journey that so many of us continue to be on. Alexis, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. It's a little bit longer one, but I'll read
Okay.
it. As a white male, my observation is that the term systematic racism draws emotional responses that divert the narrative from true dialogue. This book and the term caste essentially explain the concept in a manner that is non-emotional, which facilitates truer discussion and understanding. Do the panelists agree? And if yes, how can we influence/alter caste instead of race on the national discussion and thought process?
Elder Mahmoud, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. I'm in favor of caste. I've been using it for a long time. And I'll start you with a book. It's written in the 1940s called Caste and Class in a Southern Town by John Dollard, D-O-L-L-A-R-D. That's a starting point. Before this all emerged, some of us have been using the word caste. That's what I call white supremacy, is a caste system, but however you want to define that. You can't escape that. That caste means you inherited certain station in life, which you can't. Let me make it simple. If we were living in 1765, 1790, 1820, a Black person will be defined by the child that comes out of a Black woman's womb, legalized. It started in Virginia in 1661, because what was happening in this country is that due to the wholesale rape of Black women by largely white men, you produced people, who don't like to talk about this, categories of people you used to define in the census as white, including white men, Black, and mulatto. That didn't change until 1920, when they got rid of the word. I went to school with people, and beautiful people, who define themselves as mulatto and try to think out of what is that, a mulatto? That's an artificial creation by a caste system, which creates these divisions among people. And we need to understand that nobody can write a perfect book. I want to say this on behalf of the author Wilkerson. She's done a work that we will be talking about 10 or 15 years from now. She's gone as far as practically anybody besides the people who overthrew white supremacy and social science, the Margaret Meads and the names escape me, the John Dollars and others, because previous to, and I hope you don't mind this, the 1930s, pseudo-racism controlled social science. And there were people who came up, some young social scientists, largely cultural anthropologists and so forth, overthrew the white supremacy doctrine in social science. Margaret Mead was one of them. She's maybe the best known anthropologist in the world who got exposure to national media. She and James Baldwin had a debate on talk on race, and it was recorded and was done in a play and so forth. So this has been on the table for a long time among certain people. What she, in her book, is a kind of a breakthrough book. I can refer you to George Williamson's White Supremacy, which is a parallel study of South Africa and the United States, that there are twin evils. South Africa borrowed her laws from the United States in 1940 when it set up apartheid. So did the Nuremberg laws in 1929, 1930. The Nazis looked at the United States as the model for setting up this thing of race. They made a religion. Think about that. That's why race is false. They made Jews a religion. They said the Jewish race. There's no such thing as a Jewish race. Religion is a belief. And people who are Jews look like everybody else, including Black people in America. That's not, but you believe that, the power of propaganda and so forth make you think that Jews are a race. Any Jew, that's a belief system. It's about Hebrews. There are people in Ethiopia who are Jews. What are you talking about? But we are controlled. The first thing you've got to admit, and I admit it to myself, is that I speak white supremacy. Because that's the language. I had to get it out of my system the way I looked at other Black people. It's the way the language taught me to look at people. If we were living in the 19th century, you know that there's such a thing as a happy darky standing on a plantation. It changed after the image of Black people after the Civil War to this dangerous rapist Negro with a razor in his hand. And so the image, the media is the message. It controls everything. The two greatest culprits in promoting racism through language. And they compete with one another. One of them, you're not going to, you think I'm off my rocker by saying this, is the school system, public, private, and parochial, all convey the doctrine of white supremacy. Hollywood, believe it or not, we love Hollywood because it's pop culture and so forth, has been, along with the school system of America, been the greatest propagators of white supremacy. Those two American institutions.
Thank you, Elder. Dr. Tyner, I want to give you a chance to respond there. And let me first say, if you all, everyone who is here, could fill out the survey about this book club so that we can improve future programming, we would appreciate that. I believe Kia Vang just dropped that into the chat for everybody to see. But Dr. Tyner, I want to give you a chance to respond to that same question.
I just hope we can be cautious of not getting lost alone in the terms, because the terms change. If you ask someone in the 90s who was a progressive white, you were hip, hippity hop. Now you're woke. The words change, but the reality of it is Whether you're hip or woke, the structures are still the same. So I hope that we don't get lost in whether or not we're talking about caste or structural racism. Yes, there are some nuances of each, that we keep laser focus on the real issue at hand. The type of taxonomic structures that cause people to lose their life, that cause violence around the world, as Professor Gibney talked about, of capitalism, not living out to the creed, even of Adam Smith in some ways, about universal opulence. How do we make it work? Is there more than just greed and more than money? Is there more than power? So as we look at all these pieces, I just hope that we don't get lost in the words. And maybe that's a bit of a luxury. Sometimes I laugh at myself. I think my grandmother would be riddled at my day-to-day life, that I can spend hours on a Zoom call and get paid and talk about issues all day long, where she was scrubbing floors and cleaning kitchens. She would be perplexed on what I do all day. That sometimes we have such a luxury that we forget the day-to-day lives of everyday people that are suffering under this hand of oppression. We all can come up with a different name, but what Isabel Wilkerson tries to give us is just a common language around caste. And when we're talking about caste, we're really talking about a taxonomic structure that says whose life matters. I think we have to grapple with that. Whose life has value? Whose life is worth anything? Whose life is acknowledged by the law? And notice when I talk about whose life matters, I'm not talking about the sense that the reality of it is that it could be your brother or sister that loses their life as the hands of this oppression, caste, structural racism, fill in the blank, and we still have a loss of life. So I would caution us not to get lost in language, but follow that narrative back to its origins, and you will see that the same taxonomic structures just exist. We just change the words on how we describe it, depending on what's in the cultural norm at that time.
Thank you so much,
Thank you for that, Dr. Tyner. I just have to say, and I have a beef because I'm a writer myself, but I feel like language forecloses our possibilities for transformation. So to me, it actually does, and a lot of other scholars, it does matter if you call it caste or structural racism, because that then ties you to other histories, other bits of research, other taxonomies, as you say, that can open up different possibilities. So I understand that I'm, that language is my bread and butter. I mean, I know it is yours too, but I actually feel like it is part of the work. It's very important.
I appreciate that. Go ahead, Shannon.
I concur. That's not my issue that I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about the discourse of language per se. Once again, that's why I brought up my grandmother in this conversation. She didn't have the luxury to debate on language. She had a reality that living in the South, it might pose just her very existence, the possibility of being lynched, raped, or brutalized. So we, to a certain extent, we have to acknowledge that what we're doing right now is a privilege as well. And that as we go into our community, we have to make sure that we're having the right type of discourse to acknowledge that the day-to-day life of the language that people are talking is survival. So I agree language matters. That I would be contradicting myself. But what I'm saying on the broader scale, how do we make this conversation accessible, strategic, and how do we hold ourselves accountable? And sometimes language can get us so lost that we don't get beyond a conversation. So I concur, I agree with you. There's no debate there.
Thank you, Dr. Tyner. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks to everybody. We only have a few minutes left here. And I guess I'll close here. Well, first and foremost, thanks to everybody. And please subscribe to the newsletter. Please join the book club. I don't know how many 2-hour Zooms you all have done, but we had 600 people stick with us. That's a pretty big party. 900, I believe, at the peak. And I'm just overwhelmed by what this was. This was an incredible conversation. People are obviously engaged. I would encourage people, if we didn't get to your questions, you can find all of these people one way or the other. And if you reach out to either the library or myself, we'll try to point you in the right direction if you have additional questions, because I know this conversation will continue. We're just grateful overall that this worked, that this was more than just a Google Doc, which was my bad idea at the start of it, which I don't think that would have worked out like this if I had done it my way, which is a great reason to collaborate with people who are smarter than you are. I thought about my great-great-grandmother just coming into today, Mary Ann Key, who was purchased as a 14-year-old. My oldest daughter's 13. So I think a lot about that. And I have to wonder, you know, in those fields in Georgia and Alabama, if she could see a brighter day. You know, I have to wonder if in the darkest moments, she thought that at some point change might come. And I just have to believe she did. And I just have to believe that whether she knew that a moment like this would come or not, that she held on to some sense of faith that things would not always be the way that they were. And I have to believe in this moment that things will not always be the way that they are. And I hope the next generation can continue to say that until we are talking more about the progress than the challenges and the hurdles. So thanks to everybody. This is not a one-time thing. We intend to make this something that I hope lasts forever. More panels, more books. Thanks again to Hennepin County Library, friends of the Hennepin County Library. Thanks to the Star Tribune, our panelists, Shannon Gibney, Mahmoud El-Kati, Lissa Jones-Lofgren, Ramona, Kitto Stately, Dr. Artika, Tyner, Terri, Thao, all incredible individuals who are so much smarter than I could ever imagine to be. And I learned so much just being in your presence. And I'm really, really grateful. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, because again, that's a pretty big party, almost 600 people in 2 hours, 900 at its peak. And most importantly, I would just say, go out and do something. I think that's the point of all of this is don't just sit with this, turn it into some kind of action, because I think that's the only way to truly achieve the equality, to get rid of the inequities that continue to plague us. So thank you all again. Good night. I'm grateful.